Welcome back to the second episode of the J Edmonds Performance Podcast. Today I'm going to go over a viewer question in regards to developing speed for the field and court sport athlete. So I'm going to get straight into it from Sean. And what Sean asked is, should I be dedicating sessions to maximal sprinting speed or just focusing on acceleration? And I think this is a really common question that I get in the world of speed training for the field and court sport athlete. A lot of coaches and athletes sort of fall into the trap thinking that, because sport is acceleration dominant, that we don't need to address maximal sprinting speed. And unfortunately, this is sort of a bit misleading for a few reasons. So the number one, there's some great research that's come out from Ken Clark, sort of going over how, with NFL Combine athletes, about how quickly athletes actually get up to top speed, and a lot quicker than a lot of people thought compared to, say, a track athlete. So what Ken's research found was that after about 20 meters, most athletes are already up to sort of 95% plus of their max velocity in already a very short time frame. So for me, compared to, say, track athletes that might be accelerating up to 50, 60, even up to 70 meters due to how the race is run, with field and court sport athletes, due to their different profiles and how they've trained, you actually reach a very high velocity very early on. So I guess with this, the important thing is understanding that we need to train both, basically. So with this, the other thing that a lot of people need to understand is that you can only accelerate to what your top speed is. So if you've got a top speed of 10 meters per second, and let's say after 20 meters you can reach 90% of your top speed, you're going to be at 9 meters per second, okay? Which is going to be a very high percentage of that top speed. If you have another athlete, for example, who might be deemed as a very good accelerator, who can sort of accelerate, they have a top speed of, let's say, 8 meters per second, and let's say they can reach 95% of their top speed after 20 meters. So if we actually look at the rate at which they can accelerate, it's faster than the athlete that can reach 10 meters per second. But because their ceiling is so much lower, they're going to be getting absolutely smashed by the athlete that can run 10 meters per second. So I think this sort of helps put into perspective where your priority should be as an athlete. Sure, we want to make sure that we're maximizing acceleration and maximizing the percentage at which we can accelerate and how quickly we can do that. But at the end of the day, if we're not actually raising the ceiling when it comes to improving our maximal sprinting speed, then we're ultimately leaving the capacity at which we can actually accelerate from. So for me, that's absolutely critical. We need to train both, but make sure that we're not actually not training max velocity, because we need to make sure that we're doing that to improve the ceiling. So I guess, how do we go about doing this? So this is probably the hardest thing to sort of integrate with strength and conditioning for field and court sport athletes. And this is because we've got to work this around what an athlete is already getting in their current training schedule. So when it comes to training load and designing programs, I still like to adhere to what I spoke about in podcast 1 around Charlie Francis high-low model. So on our high-intensity skill days, what I'm trying to focus on these days is speed. So whether that's an acceleration dominant day, which is often on day 1, and then the second day of the week, which might be day 3 or 4, will be a focus on max velocity. And on these days, what I'm trying to focus on is pairing complementary training exercises on that same day. So for me, if I'm trying to have an acceleration-focused day, on the field, pre-training, often what I'm going to do is I'm going to head out onto the field, and hopefully this is either pre-training or in the warm-up, depending on what your club, how they deem about going about training sort of sprinting performance. But you want to sort of go about maximising, anywhere from 4 to 6 high-quality sprints. So when it comes to speed training, the quality is more important than the quantity. And this is especially true if you then have to go out and do club training straight after. Because ultimately, we don't know how much sprint volume you're actually going to get in the actual session itself. So we have to be cognizant of that and be mindful that sometimes less is more, because we need to leave and make sure that we're not overfilling our bucket, so that if we do have to perform a lot of sprinting in drills, that we have a little bit left over, so we're not actually going to be overtraining too much. So for me, usually how I design a session is that we're going to have a focus on acceleration predominantly in the warm-up, and this can be through the use of resisted sprinting as well as unresisted sprinting, often paired in a contrast manner, where we're sort of focusing on doing a resisted sprint into an unresisted sprint. This is a common sort of method that's utilized. We also want to focus probably more on more horizontal plyometrics, or more plyometrics that are focusing on more velocity from that side of things. So for me, this is where the use of, say, broad jumps, triple broad jumps, standing triple jumps, bounding through left, right, etc., can be really good, because it sort of matches up and complements the acceleration forces and the horizontal forces that we're sort of getting with acceleration performance. What I'll then do from that is that if the athlete has a session, I would be mindful of the amount of sprinting meters that the athlete's going to perform that day. But ideally, I'd try and, after the skill session, get them into the gym on the same day. So a lot of people probably prefer lifting the day after a club session. And although this can work in certain situations, sometimes it can be really good to sort of keep your high days high and your low days low. So for me, once I get into the gym on an acceleration focused day, to complement the theme, I'm probably going to be focusing a lot more on our larger ranges of motion, bilateral, but also some unilateral lifts with that, and focusing on more concentric force output from that. And this is going to be through your traditional squatting, deadlifting, pulling, pressing, etc. Okay. Now, if we go over to how do we train max velocity and how we should organize this within a training week, the key things that we need to focus on is that max velocity is very technical in nature, okay? In order to sprint fast, there's two things that we need to consider. Number one, what are the outputs that the athlete is capable of generating? So this could be peak force, rate of force development, etc. And a lot of this is going to be developed by the actual stress that we're applying on the body. So whether that's in the gym, on the field, etc. But we also need to understand that max velocity is incredibly technical in nature, okay? If our technique is poor, the margin for error gets smaller, okay? So with elite level sprinters, we have athletes that can produce almost 5 times bodyweight forces on one leg in like 100 milliseconds, okay? So your margin for error as an athlete when it comes to max velocity sprinting starts to get a lot smaller, especially if your technique isn't optimal. We also know that poor mechanics can be an in particularly anterior pelvic tilt. This is often associated with butt kicking or overstriding, can increase the strain on the hamstring, okay? Which is obviously a very commonly injured muscle in a lot of field and court sport athletes. So making sure that we're maximizing the technical aspects of max velocity sprinting is going to be critical for not only a performance improvement, but also from an injury prevention point of view. So make sure that we're chasing outputs, but we're also addressing the technical side of that. So when I'm designing a session, for me, the best exercise that I've found transfer over to max velocity sprinting has been a wicket drill. So wickets are basically a series of mini hurdles that are usually about 15 centimeters tall, that are spaced out along the track. And usually they're spaced around the athlete's stride length. So this can be tricky because every athlete's stride length is going to be different based off how fast they are and also how tall they are. A very, very, reductionist sort of guideline for this can be sort of whatever your standing height is, can be a good indicator on the spacing of the hurdles. So what the purpose of the hurdles are is it forces the athlete into what we call frontside mechanics. So frontside mechanics is when the athlete is generating force through more the front side of the body. So if we break an image straight up and down, and we think about what's happening on the front side of the body, so when the knee drive gets out in front, versus what's happening on the back side of the body, which is what's happening when the foot's on the ground. Front side mechanics is focusing more on this side. So we're sort of focusing on more knee drive, landing underneath the hip, not over pushing out the back with that. And this is where the wicket drill is great because firstly, it forces the athlete to get enough vertical bounce because they have to clear the hurdle. If they're sort of stumbling and not getting enough air time, they're going to smash the hurdles as they run through them. And as a result, we know that they're not getting enough lift. The second thing is because the hurdles are spaced appropriately, it's very hard for the athlete to overstride. And as a result, we're going to get the athlete landing very close to underneath their hip, which is going to cause a very big spike in ground reaction force. So as a result, when it comes to coaching speed, I'm a big believer in coaching less, okay? Because it happens so quickly, we want to, as a coach or even as an athlete, provide less cues for the athlete so that they can basically be able to organize themselves in the drill, okay? Just like in a squat where, putting a heel raise and loading the bar in front of the athlete can help them achieve a nice deeper upright squat without having to coach too much, regardless of their mobility restrictions. Being able to use a drill like sled sprints for acceleration or wicket drills for max velocity can be a great way to sort of teach the athlete the feeling and the sensations that we're trying to achieve without having to overcoach. Because sometimes with sprinting, the more you think, the slower you run. So usually what I'll do is I will combine 4 to 5 wicket drills in my sprints. And then what I'll do is I'll then usually head into what I'd call flying sprints. There's a few ways that we can attack this, but generally a flying sprint is a way in which we can have a build-up run. This build-up window is usually anywhere from 20 to 40 meters before we have what I call the fly zone. So the fly zone is often when athletes focus on sprinting maximally in the fly zone window, and this is usually 10 to 20 meters. The reason why we do the flying sprint instead of just doing, say, a acceleration from a dead stop, which is also perfectly fine, is that it conserves energy for when the athlete gets to the fly zone. So the more energy that we can conserve when we get to that fly zone, the more likely we're going to get more volume in during that max velocity phase with that. Same thing, I'd probably perform this either in the warm-up or pre-training, depending on what your coaches has planned for the day, and then go about your skill session. And then usually in the gym, depending on the phase of the cycle, and this can change for every athlete and depending on what their goals are, but generally I'd probably focus a bit more on our isometric and eccentric muscle actions that I sort of alluded to a bit more in the first podcast. So this could be through overcoming isometrics, fast eccentrics. It can still be a combination of traditional concentric and traditional weightlifting methods with that as well. However, I'll generally be more likely to match that up due to the isometric contraction being deemed as more specific to max velocity sprinting performance, okay? So hopefully that helps give you a guideline as to whether you should be focusing on both acceleration and max velocity within your training. So the answer is obviously you need to focus on both, but it's more about the execution of those sessions and trying to complement them on similar training days with the priority of that focus on each day. So if you like this episode, guys, make sure to give me a follow on Instagram if you haven't already, and feel free to DM any future questions that you want covered in the podcast.